to this session that we've titled "It's a Long Way." Long way in more than one meaning of that term, both in terms of distance and for them, particularly the last few miles, it was a long way. Very difficult travel. It wasn't travel. Slogging through the jungle and over the mountains to get there. Our plan this morning is to turn this into a conversation with these 5 veterans. These young guys? These kids. You're the young guys. And let them tell their stories. I also want to make sure that the audience has an opportunity to ask some questions and participate as well. Let me give you just very quick background on the subject before us, and then I'll introduce the 5 panelists. They are all members of the 100th Infantry Regiment of the 32nd Division of the National Guard. When I came to Grand Rapids 30 years ago, I kept hearing about the Red Arrow Division, and I grew up in northern Wisconsin, and you need to know that because I grew up thinking the Red Arrow in Wisconsin operation. I'd grown up listening to veterans of the Red Arrow. Well, it's made up primarily of Wisconsin and Michigan National Guardsmen. And to my surprise, when I got here, I met the other half of the Red Arrow operation and learned a lot more about their history. They were called into service, actually, in 1940, mobilized before the United States had entered World War II. But obviously, to become prepared, and that meant calling up guys who had volunteered for guard duty. Some of them will tell you themselves to be weekend warriors. I forget what one of you, I think it was for the cigarette money. It was not. Well, you got still a bargain. But it definitely was not for what was in store for them. They were sent first to Louisiana to a place called Camp Beauregard. Yeah. And then later on, when they were getting ready to be shipped overseas, they ended up in Massachusetts. Ultimately departed. First, they thought for Ireland, but because the Japanese in the Pacific headed primarily towards Australia and really threatening the existence of our supply lines into all of the Pacific through Australia. And as a result of that, this group, which had not had any kind of jungle training, was sent not to Ireland, but to Australia, and then from there to New Guinea. They arrived in Australia in May of 1942, and I'm going to shorten things quickly and say they arrived in September 1942. We'll back up and I'll let them tell a little bit more about what happened. Then their job was to cross New Guinea to get to Buna and push the Japanese back, basically, over the Stanley Mountains, which are about 8,000 feet high, and back into and out of New Guinea eventually. That was the plan. That's what they got involved with. And that's all I want to say, because I want to turn this over to these gentlemen. And let me introduce them. They are on my sitting next to Jack is Steve Janicki. On my immediate left is Martin Bolt. And on the other side, on my far right, is Ed Sudzik. And sitting next to me on my right is Bob Hart. All veterans. I've gotten to know them through some conversation. We were joking this morning. Previously to this, we've always talked at the Armory. And we're not sure how this is going to work with just water to drink. But it's early. You didn't bring anything in your bag. I did, and it's foolish of me. It's early. We think we can do this with just water. Gentlemen, we're going to try to take this in some kind of order. And what I'd like to start with is the floor. No. Tell me just briefly how you got into the Guard, how you got into the service, and your early training, because there's a story even in what was going just toss it open, whoever wants to start.
I was drafted, I was not.
That's you, okay. You were drafted.
April 21st.
Yeah.
We left on a Sunday.
1940.
1940, so that's right, the peacetime draft, we had begun drafting soldiers before.
Well, you had to register, you
Yeah.
had to reach 21.
Right.
I reached 21 in December, and my number came up in January 78, when they drew the numbers, and then I wasn't drafted until April 21st.
Of what year? 41.
Yeah, 41.
Yeah, okay, but still, before the United States was officially in the war.
That was before they went to war.
Right.
I had the same circumstances. I had a draft number 1037, and I felt pretty safe. But in February, they called me and told me they were into the thousands, so I'd have to go down and physical and talk to the people, the draft board, so I did that. It was April 21st on a Sunday, and they loaded us up on a train at the depot, and they took the train into Kalamazoo, and we would stay at the hotel overnight. On the 22nd of the month, I was enlisted into the service. And ironically, the very same day, a year later, I was going up a gangplank on the lure line to ship go overseas. So I had exactly 1 year, Jack. We had 1 year.
Aurora, leaving out of San Francisco.
Yeah, talk about
That
some
was a
humor.
luxury liner, too.
Talk about some humor. When we got into Louisiana, and near Camp Livingston, they dropped us off at a railroad site. They had handed out a bunch of clips to everybody on the train, not saying what it was. Sergeant says, hold on to this, we'll get off the train. When they call us, you have to respond. So I was handed the slip and everybody else, and they said, hey, come. A bunch of guys walked over into that area and kept going. And when we were all through, there were 7 of us standing there at the track. Great big first sergeant walked up to me and says, what do you got? Are you that dumb you don't know what you're holding? So I said, yeah, I got, it looks to me like number 1. He said, you stupid fool, that's I coming. Well, that's part of the humor there. And,
Welcome to the Army.
I was probably the oldest member here. I joined
How old are you?
38. No, I don't mean in age, I mean in time of service.
Well, this, how old are you? I just tried to ask. 80 what? Oh, you're young now.
Oh, yeah.
Go on now.
My brother taught me, my brother belonged to the Guards. He taught me, and like I said, it was for cigarette money, but I didn't really smoke. And then in 1940, they came and said, you got your choice. You can either go away for a year or wait to be drafted. So I said, well, naturally, I'm going to take my year and get it, come back and get married. I got back 5 years later. But I also got married in 41, in October of 41. War broke out in December, and I didn't see my wife for 2 years and a half.
It was a difficult time.
You're not like you're as old as me, but you're not.
Let me ask something before we go any further. I've got a mic here I'm not using. Can everyone in the back hear okay without it?
Yeah.
We'll shut it off. Not trouble ourselves with that. Let's talk a little bit about the training you received in those of you that are down in Louisiana. What kind of training did you get?
Dust.
Crazy, wasn't it?
A lot of dust.
Yeah?
And we used not M1s and the old German, O3s. O3s we had. And for cannons, they used cardboard things.
Yeah.
They didn't have any guns at that time. Then we went on maneuvers. That was
Crazy.
I'm talking, when you talk down south, and that, the chiggers and those other things that get into your boy, that's terrible. You get underneath anything that's tight, and it's.
Yeah. It's.
There's a story, but I won't tell you that.
But if you was Polish, them jiggers didn't bite.
No.
You're right. It didn't bother me.
You
guys that you rode this train, don't you never said a damn thing about the funniness of the train.
We're not done yet.
We'll get to it.
If you give us a chance, we will.
Shut up, behave yourself, this is their panel.
I'm as old as they are.
He's a member of the Michigan Military Museum.
I gotta put my 2 cents in here. I was going to Davis Tech High School, which is now junior college. I was 16 years old. I got mad at the teacher. I didn't care to hang around home. And the kids that I was going around with, they either joined CC camp or they were in the National Guard. And they told me, a couple of them told me that they could help get me in the National Guard. And if I did get in, I could go to the Armory and use the swimming pool anytime I wanted to. So I joined it October 12th, 1940. I think that was on a Friday. On Monday, we were mobilized into federal service, October 15th, and I went down to Louisiana with them, 16 years old. I really thought it was something. I was really somebody because I was in there with people older than I was, and I was having a lot of fun. But then it kind of turned into a different story. But we'll let Ed say a few words there. See what he's got to say.
I was in the Guards. I was selected by my friends and neighbors.
But greetings from your government.
Yeah, but they let me put the oats in, and I think I planted the corn before I went.
You came from a farm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we went to Louisiana. They didn't give me an 03, they gave me an M1, full of grease.
You're lucky.
Yeah. Well, I was Polish. And Bono was my first sergeant. We got along.
I feel sorry.
He wasn't Polish. I don't know what nationality. What?
Italian.
Oh, he was an Italian.
Let me ask a question about the training, the kind of training you received in Louisiana. Any of it related to jungle warfare?
No.
No?
Not a bit. Everything we did was, we traveled in trucks, we went from place to place, we had jeeps, we had everything we could possibly use. When we got into the jungle, there was no use. We never had a jeep, we never had a truck, we never had a cannon. Our heaviest weapon was a 60mm mortar and machine guns, but anti-tank company was just a rifle company. Cannon company was just another rifle company at that time.
Everybody was a rifle company.
Everybody was a rifle. There was nothing there. The biggest thing we had was Louisiana.
Didn't one of you tell me that they were basically the men training you were World War I vets? So you got a lot of trench warfare training.
Yeah.
I'll tell you, some of the regular Army guys, and I'm not that smart, but some of those guys didn't even know what the hell a War Department was.
You're right there.
So it's fair to say you weren't well prepared for what was coming.
No.
Not at all, no.
Do you recall December 7, 1941?
Yeah, real well.
You were still in Louisiana.
I was in New Orleans,
So was I.
celebrating,
Oh, yeah?
having raw oysters and beer.
But you had, at that moment, you had some idea that things were about to change.
Well, not really. I'll tell you, we got into trucks to come back into Camp Livingston, and a couple got behind us in a car. We were in a truck coming back, and a woman showed up a short newspaper. It says war declared, and I thought, geez, that's strange to see that. They used to have an ad out by gas station with a bird cage, and it said they had a couple spark plugs in there, and it says war declared on old spark plugs. And that's what I thought it meant. So I got back into Camp Livingston, and then we realized what happened.
Yeah. How quickly did things change at Camp Livingston?
Overnight.
Yeah.
We didn't even stay there. We moved right out to a lake that supplied water, to Barksdale Field.
So you're immediately put on guard duty?
Right away, that's
all over
right away.
All over the town, in the state.
How long before you knew where you were going to end up?
We never knew where we were ending up till we got on board ship.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, we went to Boston.
But you didn't know where you were going,
Well,
till we got on board ship.
I thought we were going to Europe.
Well, at first, yeah.
And he turned right around and sent us to California.
That was the old Army game.
So, a lot of us drove our, we had trucks, a lot of us drove our trucks from Louisiana to Massachusetts.
Which is the shortest way to get to Australia, right?
Most of them took the train, but we had all these trucks, a huge amount of trucks, every company had trucks. And so we just drove at 35 miles an hour, which is the speed limit the Army set. And we drove between 35 and 45 miles an hour all the way from Louisiana to Massachusetts, so it took us 5 days. And we stopped at different towns and stayed there. And the attitude of the people had changed when we were in Livingston. Before the war, we were looked down on. And we were a bunch of riffraff, according to them. The minute war was declared, we were the fair-haired boys.
That's why you lost it.
Right.
But from Massachusetts, you were sent to San Francisco. By train.
By train.
By train this time.
Anything memorable about the trip across the U.S.? For some of you, your first trip across the U.S., I
Yeah.
guess.
Oh, most of
For
it.
most of you.
There's a red ball, it's one right straight to, nothing stopped.
No, it did not.
Whoops.
It did not.
It was for me.
Yeah, but they pulled us over for every little train that came by.
I'm glad you realized.
A man on a jackhammer or a little thing like that.
Handcart.
Handcart came by, they pulled a troop train over and let him go by.
Well, that was quite an experience because we had the best transportation out. We rode in sleep cars. The porter would come up and lower the bed, the bunk at night, and he'd make them up during the day. Well, we went first class on that.
Well, you're lucky.
It would be fair to say that changed before the war was over.
I believe it.
Yeah. Well, when you went across the Pacific, you had the same kind of situation. You were not on a troop carrier.
No, we were on a luxury liner, the SS Lurline. We were served by civilian workers. The food up there on the boat was very good. We went first class.
You were all on the no.
They were all on
No, you weren't.
We were all on the Lurline.
all on the lure.
Those of you went, yeah, you went later.
No, I was on.
You went on the right, okay.
I was in L company.
Actually, it was the whole, I have a list of all the boats, there was 8 or 9 of them, and most of them were, liners that passengers were, excellent accommodations, but the story about this is the first time a whole division moved across the ocean to go to war. Actually, we had one ship cruiser that escorted with us for protection. And on the way over, we were supposed to go to Sydney and land, wasn't it? The Coral Sea battle between the Japanese and the United States Navy took place, and we weren't sure if the United States had won because it was fought at night. Instead of going to Sydney, they routed us down to the southern part of Australia, Adelaide. And fortunately for our sake, we were joined with about 5 boats or ships from Australia, the corvettes escorted us in there. It was quite an experience to go into this country as an American and then meet these Australians.
Are you happy to see him?
Very. Yeah. Very. What about that first meal in Adelaide? Mutton stew. Why was that awful?
We moved up from
down, water was coming up way on the top deck.
It had either been on an ocean-going vessel before. No. Got a little seasick on the way over.
No, I did.
Somebody did. I did.
I took 2 pounds of lemon drops. I don't know, somebody told us.
That'd be a good idea.
Yeah.
You crossed the international date line on the way over.
Yeah, we crossed that. Had what do you call that, initiation
Yeah?
into, you were either a shellback or a pollywog.
Yeah.
And we had King Neptune aboard, and everybody was, had different costumes. It was crazy, but it was fun. Never realizing what we were going into. We landed in Adelaide, then we took, after a little bit, we took a train and went into Brisbane. And from Adelaide to Brisbane, there's 3 different gauges of railroad. We had to change the railroad trains 3 different times.
That was in Australia?
Yeah. And we ended up in Brisbane. From Brisbane, we took Liberty ship and went over to Port Moresby. On the way to Port Moresby, we hit a storm in the Coral Sea. And that storm was so bad, there was a boat, I forget what they call it. I call it now a yacht. And there were a couple of Australians sleeping in there. And the wind came up and took that boat right off the ship. And they threw it into the ocean. And I think they found it a few miles back in the morning. But these guys were all right. It was a skillful time.
Somebody, we've talked before about this, and I recall that you did some things to your first of all, the uniforms and the equipment you had was not really what you needed for jungle warfare. And didn't you try to camouflage the uniforms?
The word came down from the division headquarters to camouflage them, and we had no camouflage uniforms, so they brought down cans of paint, green, yellow, red, black, and they daubed our uniforms, or our fatigues is what we wore. They daubed them with this paint. Well, paint hardens when you get it on your clothing.
That's right.
And then when you get into the jungle, it melted, and I mean, it itched and drove you crazy. So we finally threw it away and went with our regular fatigues. But it was just idiotic to think that you could camouflage the uniform by regular house paint, which is oil-based paint. And the heat and the...
That's typical of the guys that were upstairs. They didn't know what the hell was going on down there.
It was a quick solution to a problem they hadn't anticipated, it sounds like.
They didn't know how to handle it.
But we were the only company, I believe, that dyed our clothing. The rest of them, the officers were smarter than my CO, and so they didn't do it. So we finally got rid of it all anyway.
You're all alive, what the hell?
Now we've progressed from 1940 really. It's now September 1942. You arrived in Port Moresby, New Guinea, late September 1942, am I right?
Yeah.
To this point, we've had a few laughs, some interesting experiences. Things are about to change pretty dramatically for you, aren't they?
Yeah. Well, you're wrong about one thing. E Company flew over.
Okay.
They were the only first airborne company in the world to be flown into combat. And they landed at Moresby by plane, got out of the plane and started over the Owen Stanleys.
That's right.
The rest of them came by boat.
Among other things about this campaign, it was the first time that the United States Army had flown a unit into combat. That of course, was going to change before World War II was over, but this was the first time they relied on air transport to get some of the soldiers into combat.
C-47s or C-54s?
C-47.
C-47.
The crazy old plane.
Let's pick it up at Port Moresby.
Okay?
You're headed to Boona. How far away roughly is it?
Couple 100 miles,
And 8,000 feet up.
at least. There were times you were walking. Huh?
Uno wasn't that high, huh?
No, Buna was down, I'm
getting
sorry,
there was
Buna was
down.
down on the other side.
Right,
But you had to go up over the Owen Stanley Mountains, one side of Guinea to the other.
We flew up part of the way.
Okay.
I did anyway.
Yeah.
And then we started walking. You walk up, and then you slide back down because of the button. But finally you get there. I started out, I think I weighed 193 pounds. When I got up there, I weighed 140. And that's just, you get these sea rations. And I happened to be the odd man on the squad. And if I wanted to eat, I had to eat all mine. These other guys could exchange, but I had to eat all mine because I was the odd man.
Odd man out.
And
What was in your sea rations, what you got?
Yeah. I either had a favorite
for beans,
a lot or what.
one can of beans, one can of stew, one can of hash, and another can that had a little hardtack and coffee, a little dissolved can of powdered coffee, and a couple of sugar cubes, and 2 pieces of candy. Chocolate candy bar.
It's good.
Oh, that was delicious.
My
That was
biggest worry,
good.
my biggest worry in the Army was not having enough water. Because I drink a lot of water.
That's what you tell what it is.
But in the jungles, you could take your shovel and just dig down maybe, about that deep, and the water just seeped right into that. The orders were, you could drink that water, but you had to put quinine pills in it, leave it set for a half hour. I couldn't wait that long. I put it in maybe 10 minutes, and then I drank it. Mud and all. Yeah. Great fun.
What was the climate, the environment like at Port Moresby when you got there? Hot there. Yeah.
It was, Fort Moresby was hot, but it wasn't too bad. It was when you got into the interior where it got terribly bad. It rained, the humidity was terrible, and it rained, and when it rained, it wasn't raining, it was a deluge. And then 10 minutes after it stopped raining, it got so hot your clothes dried right on you. You had a hard time maneuvering when we were walking over the Owen Stanley Mountains. Some of the people threw their equipment away, their rifles. It was too hard to carry. When we started out, we were wearing what they call leggings. Those were thrown away. Gas masks were thrown away. We were told that if you had another party make a tent with, a puck tent was made of 2 squares and a triangle. We were told that we could rip the triangle off and keep the 2 squares to make it easier, take some of the weight off. And I cut off the wrong side. I cut off the square, and I had 1 square with an angle, and nobody wanted to sleep with me. It was out from under the tent, and you could put it up. We had rice that we were told we could cook, but you couldn't start a fire because everything was just saturated. By the time we got to the pretty close to the front line, they had to bring over supplies and drop it to us, ammunition and rifles, because we were practically going in there with nothing, and they had to restock us.
At what point did people start getting sick?
It seemed
First day over the
first day over the mountain.
Over the mountain, yeah.
Yeah, people were getting diarrhea, dysentery, malaria. If you got malaria and you had a fever, the first ones that got it, I think they were fortunate. They sent them back into the States or back into Australia or someplace. But after being in combat for a little bit, we had so many people getting sick that they wouldn't even let you go to the medics or the hospital or whatever unless you had a temperature of 105 or you passed out. If you passed out, then they took you to the hospital tent. If you had 105 fever, they were pretty picky on whether you had 105 fever or not.
I had 104. I got in though.
That was close enough?
Yeah, I had malaria 7 times.
How about this, John? I haven't heard a word out of you.
Well, I was just gonna join in on that conversation about the malaria. The reason we kept us there at the front is that there were so many casualties that we had probably at one time 50 people on the front line. So if you were in the rear area with malaria, they kept you active enough so that if they penetrated those 50 people on the line, that you'd be able to fight back. And that's one of the reasons they kept us there all the time, at that high temperature. We couldn't get quinine, so they gave us Atiprine. And we were to take that safely every day. After about 30 days of Atiprine, your eyes turned yellow, your skin turned yellow.
You were in the crappiest part of the war.
It's just too bad that we had to have it that way.
Well, they still had quinine, Marty, because I couldn't take Ativan.
Did they have it just
Yeah.
for the selected few?
No, for those that couldn't take Ativan, because I could stand there, and the lieutenant used to stand there and make sure you took it. He would pop it down your mouth. And I'd stand there for 30 seconds and pop it right back out. And so after a few times like that, I tried to take it. It just didn't sit with me, so then they put me back on quinine, and I took my quinine regularly. Usually 5 grain tablets, you'd take about 10 grains a day.
Just out of curiosity, the 5 here, how many got malaria?
I did.
Well, all of it.
I had
5 for 5.
I had reoccurrent malaria. Even after civilian life, I used to have it.
Did you get
Every 30
it
days.
after you're out of the service?
After I was out of service for 2-3 years.
I'm looking at you 5 guys, and I'm thinking, all that you had to go through to win the war. It was horrible. And it's a long way from over yet with this story. Tell me just a little bit about the terrain and what you encountered. Were you following a trail over the Owens family?
Yeah. We had natives, some of the natives took us down the trails.
Couple Aussies.
Couple Aussies, right. It was, the growth was so thick that when you looked over to your right or left, you had to be directly, the person had to be directly in front of you. You looked to the right or left, you couldn't see anything. The road was so thick. Yeah. It was muddy.
Muddy and thick of wood. How wide was the trail? I'm trying to get
like
a good visual image
it's
of what
like a trail.
It's a path.
It's a path.
Yeah. Single file? One man.
Single file. Yeah.
And how many of you are following single file, roughly?
Everybody. I mean, that was, what I mean by that.
3,000 of you over here?
I don't know. I can't tell you that.
Okay.
Our company, there must have been 100, 120, 125 maybe. But you followed one another, and when you stopped for the evening, and then we were going to put up our tent, you found a little opening off the side, but nobody was close enough because there wasn't that much of an opening.
So you weren't out in nice open areas, you pushed back into the jungle. Big
That's what it was. We had machetes. We carried machetes with us, but I don't think anybody used them. We didn't have the strength to use them.
Once in a while, we come into a native village, and you never saw any children or women in that village.
Really?
They sent them all out into the jungle.
Now, the Japanese had come over the other way on that trail.
Same one, right.
But they sent them all in there. Started over, but the Aussies drove them back.
Okay. So these natives had had some experience with military units.
Well, they didn't know the difference.
They got the women and children out of there.
Yeah.
We if I remember correctly, we carried a box full of beads and that type of stuff to give to them. I thought that's what you wore.
He took that off the boat.
That's what he traveled today.
Well, we had a little experience there. one of the fellas, he had a nice clean vest cap, and the sun shined on it, and it really shined.
Yeah.
And the chief, he pointed to that, and that meant, I want that, I want that.
Mhm.
So he, and the officer said, you give it to him, give it to him. So he gave it to him, he had to give it to him. And then, another funny thing was, one of the fellas got his flashlight out. And he turned that on, and that native just jumped, that light, you know. And he gave it to the fella, and he dropped it, and the light shined on the ground there, and he went trying to stamp out that light. That was just something funny.
Let me ask you a question. How long were you in the game?
was 6 months.
September till we took over Boona the latter part of January.
6 months.
About roughly 5 weeks to get over the mountains, is that it?
No, it wasn't
A little
that
bit
long.
less than that? A month?
I don't know.
Yeah.
We started out in September. Our first day of combat was November 20th, 1942.
Okay,
Yeah.
How can you
About 5
remember that
weeks.
so
You
accurately?
never forget that.
No?
Because we walked in there, and you know, the usual, we're Americans,
Yeah,
we're going to take care of you right now.
yeah.
And then after the first, when you see your first casualty,
Yeah.
you change your mind.
The way it goes.
Our first casualty in our company was Hewitt Madigan.
No kidding.
Hewitt Madigan Post is named after him here.
Yeah, 126 post there.
Yeah. In Grand Rapids.
Yes.
Yeah, he was first guy
And
killed.
you change your attitude.
He was
Then
shot
you find
right
out,
there.
then you find out that, you know, these people mean business. They were ruthless.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
There isn't a good thing you can say about them. Well, then again, we didn't know them that well. But I've had people ask, how did the government teach you to kill another person?
Yeah.
They don't teach you to kill another person. They're teaching you to survive.
Survive, yeah.
And in order to survive, you have to kill.
Yeah.
And if you don't kill them, they're certainly going to kill you.
Where did you first encounter the Japanese?
Just down the other side of
Maybe you got over the hill.
Sanananda.
Sanananda, or Dobadura, depending on which way you
Yeah,
come
it
from.
depends which way it came in.
I think we hit them at Dobadura.
We were on the
Which is-
Sananda.
I can't tell you how, because these plate names, we know the names, we know the places, we were all there, but in relation to each other, we don't really know where the hell we were.
I don't know how you remember what you do remember. It's driving me out the window. I can't see how you do so well.
Well, a lot of times, everybody thinks that you're up there and
Yeah.
the Japs are there and you're gonna shoot them.
Yeah, it don't work that way.
I never saw a Jap.
Yeah.
Unfortunately,
You just fire your gun, that's
Yeah,
firepower.
unfortunately, the maps for the area were very poor.
yeah.
You gotta realize that Boona was a coconut plantation. There was no big village there. A few natives lived there, and the Australians that took care of the plantation.
Yeah.
Santa Ana Trail the same way. It was another coconut plantation. It was a hard surface area right close to the beach. And the maps that the officers worked with were just some sketches. So we never knew exactly what we were into, what terrain was, and possibly where these paths led us. So we could be living in a foxhole for
Yeah.
a week or two, we had no idea.
Never
Never
knew.
saw a map, maybe some of the sergeants did, but when they had their conferences, they probably discussed it. But the rest of us never knew where we were. We were just in the jungle, hoping to get through.
Didn't know what the hell we
Solid
were doing
ground.
either.
I think my idea of New Guinea, I think at one time it was the Garden of Eden. And then the Lord got mad at Adam and Eve. And he made it Satan's septic tank. Really.
That's what his trouble is, isn't it?
It's hard to try to tell people what it's like. You can't imagine
I got trouble saying.
something unless you're actually there Uh, it's like a woman trying to tell a male what it's like to have a baby. The pain is there. I don't care. The pain is there, but you can't, a person can't imagine it unless you experience it.
I'll tell you, my experience is that if I owned Boona and I owned hell, I would rent out Boona and live in hell.
Not a pleasant place.
Not a pleasant thing.
You encounter the Japanese for the first time November 20,
Right,
1942.
right.
Boona fell in January.
January.
So you were in constant contact
Constant.
with the Japanese during that
Right.
month and a half.
There was no thing going back and wreck.
No.
You couldn't get replacements. Everybody was sick. Replacements weren't coming in. I think finally, maybe in January, if I'm not mistaken, I think, what was it, either the 41st or the 24th?
41st.
Came in? 41st?
41st.
They kind of relieved us.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about what, to the degree you want to, about what that fighting was like. It was not trench warfare.
No.
It was, were there definable lines? Did you have a...
No, nothing. You couldn't see anything.
Now, to a degree, now, you were probably in a couple, Steve. The Japanese had what they called a banzai charge.
Right.
And you would be laying there, and you would be in a loose formation of a line and facing the jungle, and all of a sudden you'd hear some officer start to holler. And as he hollered, then it would pick up in crescendo, get louder and louder, and all the men were screaming and hollering, and then here they come. And this wasn't a bad thing. It scared the hell out of you at first, but it made them targets. Instead of creeping through there, which they could have done very easily, when they used to started the banzai charges at first, and then they realized that this wasn't the way to go, because we could just lay there and hear them coming and see the brush moving and cut loose with our M1s and
Whatever you had.
whatever we had and cut them down. Kunai grass. Yeah, well, through the kunai grass too. The kunai grass is a saw-bladed grass that'll cut your hand if you.
Oh,
it's
that's
sharp.
hard, yeah.
And it
Like
can
a
grow
knife.
as high as 10, 12 feet.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's only 2, 3 feet, but it'll grow as high as 10, 12 feet high, and you have to go through there, and you wind up with the scars going through there.
Yeah, the natives, they made the shingles out of that grass.
Oh,
They
they
cut
did?
it, and then they cut bamboo poles, and they bent that grass over, and then they knitted it some way with the grass. I watched them, but I couldn't catch on. And then they put it on their roofs.
Like a thatched roof almost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
was that
and
tough?
yeah, that water would rain, and it wouldn't rain in there, you know.
Tough stuff to go charging through.
Yeah. Kunai grass is like palms on Palm Sunday.
Okay.
Same thing.
Good. Hardly a grass at all.
It's like palms you get in church on Palm Sunday.
Were you able to dig in this environment?
Oh, yeah.
Well, yeah, you had to, but you know, you hit water, and you were in mud all the time.
Well, we were so close to the ocean that you would dig in sometimes, and you could dig down a foot or so and make your foxhole by piling the mud around it. But then the tide would come in, and as the tide came in, the water level rose in your foxhole until you were setting in 2 or 3 inches of water. But you didn't move. You didn't move. They used to, the Japanese used to go up in the trees with snipers. They'd bring up a 50 caliber machine gun. And they'd be straight on the top, and they'd take the top of the trees right off. That's when he killed him. Adam fell right out of the tree, fell right over the tree, that's what he did.
At this point, your supplies are now being flown in.
Well, what little bit we got.
What you got?
They were flown into, we captured an airstrip up there and they were able to fly in the planes. But then the natives, we call them fuzzy wuzzy.
Enemy line, and the insignia points out that the Red Arrow Division has penetrated every line that it ever faced. And while we were over there in the jungles, we fought the Imperial Army, the Japanese, and it goes to credit for all these people you're looking at now and those that stayed behind. You got to credit to them that they actually gave their lives so that we could come back.
Couple points, and this is an appropriate point to make. Number one, the 32nd spent more time continuous in that action than any other unit in the United States Army during World War II.
Right.
They were in early and
They were in and they stayed. And number two, this defeat in New Guinea was the first defeat administered to the Japanese Army. It was the start of turning things around. So we are dealing with a group of people, and in many ways, it's a story for all that's been said about World War II in recent years. This campaign is still not that well known, and the contributions of the men of West Michigan and northern Wisconsin is still not that well known. Let's pick it up at this point. We've talked about the fighting in the jungle. At this point, every one of you has lost a lot of weight. Every one of you has been sick. Some of you, were any of you rotated back because your illness was so bad?
Yeah, I did.
You did?
Yeah.
Okay. That's right, 104.8,
Yeah.
which today would get you in the emergency room and intensive care real fast. Luna finally is in American hands on January 2nd, 1943. What happens for the 126th at that point? You stay there?
No, we went back to Australia.
Okay.
We went back for beachland.
Remember that training?
Yeah?
We was in a boat, and they said, everybody jump out in the water. The water was pretty deep. I said, I can't swim. Some guy grabs me, throws me over. I kept my mouth shut. I rode the waves, and I got to shore.
That was your beach training.
Yeah.
So it's fair to say that it wasn't real formally structured beach training.
Well, it was after we really started it.
Okay.
It got pretty serious because MacArthur really led us into slaughter in New Guinea. He didn't lead us; he pushed us. He was no place there to lead us. He was in Fort Moresby.
Right.
We've had a lot of controversy on that because even one of our generals told him that he was leading us to slaughter, General Harding. And MacArthur took that as an insult and sent Harding back to the United States and put him behind a desk in Washington. And it was sad because General Harding was soldier general. But then we got into beach landing training. And we were on that, I think, maybe 6 weeks.
Okay. What, Steve, training for...
One thing to bring up is when General Harding was removed, because he thought of the welfare of the men, but MacArthur removed him because he knew that we had no replacements. We could not back up. We could not retreat because we'd have been overrun. We had to keep pushing. So he brought in General Robert L. Eichelberger. And General Eichelberger was sent up there with the express desire from MacArthur, you either go ahead or don't come back. And so we went ahead. And of course, we named the graveyard there Eichelberger Square for a long time.
There were more casualties under Eichelberger than there was under Harding.
Yes.
Yeah.
But we had to push it.
How many
We
guys
could
were
not
lost?
stop. If we had stopped, the Japs would have run over. we had,
75%, oh my God.
we were outnumbered at least 7-1, but we had the firepower. We had the M1s that fired 8 rounds at a clip. The Japs were firing their little old 25 caliber rifle that had a 5 shot clip, and you had to pull a bolt back every time. With the M1, you could pull the trigger 8 times, slam in another clip, start all over again. We had the firepower, we had the men to do it, because our mentality was smarter than the Japanese. We were always told this, and I believe it to this day.
I could bypass something that was mentioned, the R&R. We hadn't been paid for about 4 months, so they moved us into a beach area like Holland and Grand Haven. Tweedhead and Coolangatta is the name of it. And they gave us fresh cotton and sweater to wear with about 4 months' pay, and then they turned us loose. And it goes without saying that we had a one good month down there before we went back to training. And we put on our weight. We went into the Australian restaurants and got steak and eggs.
Oh boy, now, for 25 cents,
Yeah.
American money.
So we did have some pleasure in life outside of fighting all the time.
I know first time I went to the restaurant, I said, I want bacon and eggs. The waitress looked at me, bacon? We ain't got no bacon. We got steak and eggs. I said, steak and eggs for breakfast? She said, try it, you'll like it. And boy, it was good.
Especially after sea rations.
You know, when we were in Australia, it was still primitive. They didn't know what a hamburger was. The guys used to pitch in and have a guy go into town and get steaks that were about this big, must have been that thick. We put them on like a fire, not a fireplace, but a fire pit, and we cooked those up, and it was cheap. In fact, the Australian government tried to get MacArthur to have our government pay us the same wages that the Australian government was paying their troops, because we were spending money like what, drunken sailors, because we had it, we didn't know if we were gonna, but we were making much more. We were making much more money than the Australian troops were making, and it kind of made them look bad. They couldn't do what we were doing, and then all of a sudden the prices started going up, and then they couldn't afford it. And there was a lot of dissent, you know, people were getting to, they were upset with us because we could do things that they couldn't afford to do. And the prices were going up and up.
While you're, the obvious question, why were you getting beach landing training at this point? Where were you headed?
Well, they realized that we, instead of landing, well, we had to get to the islands. So that was the reason for the beach training. There was no other way you could get to the islands.
Which islands are we talking about?
Well, we went into Mauritania, we went in the northern part of, or western part of New Guinea, and you couldn't start all over again.
Yeah, all of New Guinea had not been taken at this point. That's what I'm getting at. You had to go back to New Guinea for more landings in New Guinea.
Right.
Okay.
And they had trained us at one time. We left Australia. We wound up on Goodenough Island, and we were supposed to go into Peleliu. And instead, after we were there a while, they changed the orders, and the Marines landed at Peleliu, and we went back and landed at Atapi. I was privy to that because I was working in the office at that time, so I know what happened.
How many of you participated in beach landings?
All
All of you did?
well,
You're sick, right? You were sick at this point.
Well-
and what happened then?
When we had their R&R so-called, they said everybody's gonna get a furlough, 7 days with travel time. Then it went down to 7 days with travel time. Now, myself and two other guys went down to Sydney. And in the process, we went to different places, so-called, and then we went to the horse races. And sitting out there in the blinding sun, I had a heart attack. I had a malaria attack again, shaking like a leaf in that hot sun. And finally, the two guys took me downtown. We went to the American Club there, and I don't know if somebody there reported it. The military police came and got me and took me out to the hospital, and then on I just went into a replacement company.
Okay. So you got separated from the rest of these guys at that time?
Well, I found out later that I was listed as AWOL.
Uh-huh. You knew where you were.
Yeah, I know where. I had to take the, they lost all my records. I had to get my, what do you call it, test on how much you know. Which I took over.
IQ test.
Yeah. And then the guy asked me if I wanted to take a clerking test. I said, sure. I passed that 100%. The next thing I know, I was in the finance department. That's where I ended up in the war.
Like the Battle of Sydney, eh? Jack?
Huh?
Then you fought the Battle of Sydney.
You betcha. That's what I got my medals for.
On the paperwork.
Married over there.
He's a wild guy, isn't he?
Jack got married in Australia.
This guy did?
This guy.
Oh, my God. The girl from over there?
Well, I married an Australian nurse who was, she was in Egypt and in Syria even before we entered the war.
Mm-hmm.
And then she came back and decided she was going into commercial nursing, which she did. And her unit went on up into Singapore, and they were captured by the Japanese. They treated those women terrible.
Where was she from, Jack?
What's that?
Where was your wife from?
She was from Tasmania.
Good.
She passed away just a month ago.
Yeah.
She lived to be 90 years old. That's pretty damn good.
That's pretty good.
Yes, it is.
So you tell me, 4 of you are back in combat again, in New Guinea. Any strong recollections about those beach landings and what happened to you then?
Yeah, I do.
All right.
We were assigned to go in on Red Beach. They had 3 invasion points I stayed on, and we were assigned Red Beach. Well, our officers and their non-coms were instructed how to go ashore and which path to take. We went ashore and took our path that was laid out for us. They were to capture the airfield. We were up the coast probably about a mile away from the ocean, and all of a sudden our bombers came in. And we could hear them coming from a distance. They started dropping the bombs, and of course we hit the dirt, laid down amongst all those logs that were laying there, and the ground was just jumping. And all of a sudden we heard somebody coming up behind us. It was a captain from C Company. He said, "What are you jerks doing up here?" "Well, we're supposed to be here on Red Beach." He said, "You're on Blue Beach, and it's my job to capture that airfield after the bombing's over. Get out of here." So we were ahead of the company.
It was easy to get disoriented.
Oh, it's just, it seemed funny to turn around here, another company coming up behind you with their rifles and everything.
Somebody was in the wrong place.
Did the Villa Verde Trail affect any of you fellas?
No. No.
That was later.
That was the northern
That's
part
in the
of
Philippines.
Philippines.
But the Red Arrow left a calling there, a marker, right?
Yeah.
And to carry this story on, eventually the United States or the Allied troops take New Guinea.
Right.
The next destination is the Philippines.
Well, we landed in Morotai.
All right.
the little island, if you look on a map, it's about the size of a pinhead.
12 miles wide.
Yeah, but we landed there. We didn't have too much opposition, but we had a little bit. And from there, that was the jumping point. We went to the Philippines. We landed in Leyte.
At first we hit Atapi, then Sador.
Yeah, HAP, Sador, then Morotai.
So 3 beach landings.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then we went to the Philippines. We landed in Leyte. I did. I don't know how many.
You're the only one, Steve.
Okay. We landed in Leyte.
You didn't go to the Philippines.
I was late.
You were,
Well, you-
so you two were late.
But,
Okay.
but don't you remember, we went to Morotai to learn how to march in the parade?
Yeah.
We were going to take MacArthur
Yeah.
into Luzon.
Right.
And MacArthur returned.
Yeah.
We were supposed to be his division. But unfortunately, again, lady, as we go from Morotai, the war turned against us in Lady, so they grabbed the closest division, that was us,
Us again.
and went back into the action at Lady. We never got to march with MacArthur.
That was a joy. But we landed in Leyte. I remember going up into Tacloban. It's a little town. I call it north. Actually, I think it's north and west, but irregardless. I was in a pineapple plantation. And somehow or other, we were called back to the beach. And as we were coming to the beach, we were standing there wondering, what are we doing here? And then all of a sudden there were 3 LCIs coming in, Lightning Craft Infantry. And boy, they zoomed in. 2 of them took off this way and one come in, and he dropped the plank or whatever you want to call it. And here 2 guys grabbed MacArthur, and they carried him off the LCI, and they put him down in the water, and somebody started hollering, no, 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 that's no good. So they put him back on, and he backed off, and they made 3 takes on that. To make him look good. They finally put him in about a foot of water, and he had his, those aviator glasses, and he put his pipe in his mouth, and he hollered, I have returned. And I heard some of the guys say, well, I wouldn't want to repeat that. Some of them said, well, where the hell have you been? But that was about it. From there, I got malaria. I ended up in a hospital center. They sent me home. I landed in San Francisco in, I think, the middle of January of '45. I got home. I think 3 or 4 days. My birthday is on February 4th. And I think I got home on February, 3 days before my 21st birthday. And I walked into a bar, Kelly's Bar, on Colebrook in Ionia. And boy, I'm big, Give me a shot in the beer. And the guy said, get out, you're not 21. But that's when I knew I was back home. But I don't regret anything I did.
How about some of the rest of you? When did you finally get home?
I got discharged July 2nd, 44.
Okay.
God, you got out early.
Yeah, well, I was the first bunch from our company come back on rotation from New Guinea.
I came back for 30 days and went back again.
The paper war is never over.
I guess I have seniority. I didn't get home till August 6, 1945, the day they dropped the atomic
Oh, I
bomb.
got you there.
Did you get, well, yeah,
I
but
got out of...
you had a bride you went back to.
You didn't want it.
No, I had to wait for her, yes.
Oh, did you?
I got out in October.
Oh, there's a guy that forgot to shave.
Be nice to Santa Claus. Be nice to
I spent a year in the hospital.
So from 1940 to 45, 5 years.
Yeah.
Okay. And I just was looking here in the cover of this book, for the record, this unit, the 32nd spent more time than any other U.S. division in combat, 654 days of combat during World War II. And then they were finally inactivated in 1946. And I had picked up some numbers from that New Guinea campaign, 1,954 killed and wounded out of, what do we figure about, a little over 3,000 men, something like that. And nearly all of them, 2,900, over 2,900 in the hospital with disease at one point or another. The jungle got just about everybody before it was over.
Another thing you get in the jungle is what they call jungle rot.
Yeah?
And it's like a boil. The boil comes up, the jungle rot goes down. And finally when it breaks, you could see right down to your bones.
You
I
just
had
poured
two
right
of them
into
in
your
my leg.
food.
Now, they wouldn't let you, in the hospital, they gave me, just absolutely still, keep that leg right still.
That's terrible.
Bad stuff. What were your reactions when you got home? What were the reactions of the folks that saw you when you got home?
Well, we didn't get met, we weren't met by photographers and crowds standing around cheering us. When I got off the train, my wife was there and my parents, and that was it. And probably the same with everybody here.
You came home a few at a time?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah, nobody came over the group, I'm pretty sure of that.
This when they got by the boat, when
You came, and when you got off the troop ship, then you were in.
Well, we're talking about home.
And then you dispersed across country or on trains back to the back.
typical Army, got on the train, came all the way here to Chicago, and the guy got up in front, some officer, and he says, I got some good news and I got some bad news. And somebody said, well, give us the bad news. He said, well, you left your records in California. So he said, everybody get a week's vacation, and then you'll come back and you'll get your discharge.
So they didn't have the records to discharge you when you got
No,
home.
you
Great.
gotta go home, then come back.
Typical Army.
Well, I came into Union Depot, Grand Rapids, and as the train slowed down, I knew there wasn't going to be anybody at the station. I jumped off the opposite side of the train, and I walked off Fulton Street West to Lane and Sibley. That's where I lived. My mom was home. My dad was working. He worked for Stowe Davis Furniture Company.
Yeah.
And that was it.
Knock on the door, hi Mom, I'm home.
That was it. I hugged Mom. I cried.
Yeah.
That was it.
Same for the rest of you.
Mine was a little different. I stayed over, I stayed over the first night in Chicago. We were discharged out of the Great Lakes station, and we went into Chicago. I couldn't catch a train home, so we stayed the first night in Chicago. I called home, of course. It isn't like having a cell phone. But finally I had a chance to call home, told them I was in Chicago, I'd be home the following day. And of course, that brought out a lot of my family's friends and my folks. And the girl I was engaged to, I was planning on marrying her in 1941. But I'd go into service for a year and I'd be home to get married. But it's 4 years later, 4.5 years later. Well, as the train pulled into Holland, I was a little excited and nervous. And I couldn't sit still, so I stood and walked the aisles a little bit. When we got to Granville, I looked out and I recognized some of the area. And by the time we pulled into the depot, my legs were shaking and I tried to walk down the track. I couldn't do it. I was staggering. I said, well, they'll think I'm drunk. So I started running, and I ran all the rest of the way through the creek, and I ran in to see my family there. It was a great reunion for us.
Had to have been. Yes, it was. For each and every one of you.
When I got to Grand Rapids, got off the train, my cousin worked Quimby Kane Paper Company there right on Ionia. I went in there, And he says, I'm gonna leave work. He told the boss, I'm leaving work. So we went to a bar, and they kept bringing drinks, anything I wanted, drinks. By the time we got to his place, I was feeling pretty good.
Those are the good old days.
Yeah.
And you had every right to.
Yeah.
Every right you did.
Let's talk about New Guinea. We was walking along the beach once, and I carried half a pound sticks of dynamite, and the natives, they were fishing with spears, you know, in the ocean. And there's, in every bunch of natives, there was one guy that talked English, and he was standing outside. The other ones are in the water, and I said, I'll show you how we fish in Michigan. How do you fish in Michigan? I said, you get your boys out. Then I asked the guy carrying the fuse, give me a fuse. So he got his boys out. I lit that fuse and I was holding it till it got burned down. I threw that dynamite in there. It went boom. I said, tell your boys go in there. They jumped in there and they came out with fish. I don't know what they were. I seen them in meat markets in Australia. There was white on one side and blue on the other. They were flat. They was carrying armful of it. I thought they'd give us one, but they never did. I thought, Jesus, I'd like one of them, you know, make a fire and see how they taste.
Teach them how to fish, and that's the gratitude they show. Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure to talk with you again this morning and to hear your story. I firmly believe it's a story that West Michigan needs to know better, if not all of the country, of the contributions that these units made in World War II. We've got a few minutes left, and if there are any questions or comments.
There's something, you was talking about some kind of a book about New Guinea.
Mm-hmm.
You want one of them?
You got one?
I got one.
All right. Yeah. For the record, the Center for Military History in Washington, D.C. has published a book on the New Guinea campaign. Published it right after the end of World War II. It's still in print and still available. And it's probably the single best source of the day-to-day activities of this unit in New Guinea.
I think I got one.
Okay.
One thing I'd like to say
I think I got it.
is dispel any doubt in anybody's mind. If you think we weren't scared, you're crazy. We'd go around, all of us were scared. I know damn well we were. We'd go around, you had a knot in your stomach. But you performed is what you did. But you were scared.
Had to be.
You might.
If you weren't very smart.
You weren't very brave, and you wound up dead.
Actually, there's two books. This is the other. This one has been out for a good long time. It's been reprinted now.
Yes.
It's called the 32nd Infantry Division, World War II.
Made available to the Battery Press out of Nashville, Tennessee, if anybody wants to.
Come up afterwards and we'll give you the information on that one, and actually on both of them. Now, any questions out of the audience? Yes, ma'am.
Okay. My husband was in the Red Arrow. And at one time, he was in what they call the Lost Company. I could never get any information on
I
it.
Company.
Is that what it was?
Was it I Company?
I Company was a lost company.
What's the story?
They just got
Disoriented.
disoriented and they stayed there for a few days. A good friend of mine, Bob Reef, was in it. What was your husband's name?
Wayne Lowen.
Wayne
Oh,
Lowen.
yeah, we know Wayne.
Yeah,
Oh, hell, I can't see you, Mr. Lowen.
That's all right, you're right.
That's all right.
Could you tell us more? Dad wouldn't talk about it, and as our moderator said, whatever you're comfortable with. Were any of you in the Lost Company with Dad?
No.
No.
Okay.
Anybody here?
I originally was an I Company. My background was communications and civilian, and they had a school at that time. I was in basic training, and I went to the communications school. I ended up as a switchboard operator and stringing wire to field phones. To visualize what it is, if you look at a wagon wheel, the hub is the regimental headquarters, and they'll string 1,000 regimental. And I didn't know Wayne, I knew who he was, but I didn't know him when I was in Akron. But I was only in their basic training 6 weeks.
There, you have gotten a fairly good idea of what we went through. There's a lot of things that
We could talk all day.
yeah, you could talk all day.
Never get to the end of the story.
The thing, the most, you can't go out and say, well, I killed so many, I killed so many. You don't do things like that. There are times, New Guinea was so bad that if a body laid there, it was rotten in 3 days. There's nothing that stinks more on the face of the earth than a human body that is rotting. And
Those are the kind of memories you carry around.
and this is, and you don't broadcast this stuff. It's none of your business. You don't want to hurt nobody.
Other comments from over here?
I
Yes,
have a
ma'am.
question. I'd like to start with Ed and go around the pan. I'd like to know how old they were when they went in the service.
Okay, each of you.
I was 21.
21.
21.
16.
21.
24.
24 over here.
I do a lot of
Other
lives.
vets in the audience while we're doing it?
17.
17.
And he lied.
Glad to get in. Yeah, he couldn't get in at 16. Yeah. It's amazing to serve 5 years and come home and still not be able to buy a beer in a barn.
And another thing, that swimming pool that these guys told me that I could use, I never did get to swim there. They tore the place down for posterity.
Another comment or question here?
Excuse me, any of these gentlemen been back to the area?
Good question.
The only one that we know that went back was Roy Jurgen. Smith. Did Ralph go too?
2 times.
Okay, but Roy Smith did go. He went to Port Moresby, and I understand he took a helicopter and flew over the Owen Stanley, and he went to visit the cemetery at Buna. I don't know if there's much, I don't think there's much of a cemetery left there. I think that was all.
Oh, they say there's hotels over there now,
Yeah.
like in New York.
Well, Fort Moresby's got about 70,000 people there.
Wasn't that big when you were there?
No.
When you look back, it was little, but today you don't want to go back because it's not like it was.
We had an open shower there downtown, and a couple guys and I took this open shower, and right there, everybody could see you.
The native women were washing their back.
Oh, Jacob Median.
A little bit different.
Yeah.
Question here, comment.
Well, my dad used to sing a song and it started out, I'm mighty proud to be one of the loud of the 126 Infantry. Do any of you guys know the rest of the song?
The only one I think we used to sing was Bless Them All. The long and the short and the tall. We don't know promotions this side of the ocean, so cheer up my lads, bless them all.
You're right. Well, fellas, this has been a hell of a day.
Well, we got one more.
Gordon asked you gentlemen whether you all remembered December 7th, 1941. I'd like to ask, do any of you remember April the 12th, 1945, the day that Franklin D. Roosevelt died? If so, I'd like your reaction.
Yes, I do.
Yep. What's your recollection?
It was, to me, it was sad. I feel like we lost everything. you lost a man that really
He did
took
a
us
lot.
through hard times. I think he's the best president we ever had. And then I think Truman was the next best.
You're right.
But I think I felt like the country lost everything that we fought for.
We did more than any other president. Longest serving, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Right.
Any of the others have reflections on that?
Oh. Comment. I'd
Yeah.
like to thank all 5 of these gentlemen and
Absolutely.
all the rest of them that we don't get to thank
Absolutely.
for fighting for our freedom. And every Veterans Day, I think you guys. So thank you very much.
Good point.
On behalf of the Michigan Military Museum, some of you may have known that they've broken ground out of the International Airport. We are actually the sponsor of this event. We got Gordon and we got this group together. I would like to encourage you to be on the lookout for other events that we do. We do 1 lecture, 1 seminar, and 1 movie every month. And I'm glad to see that there's some familiar faces of people who are attending a few of our events. I think it's very important that the stories of men like this and women like the ones that we are featuring in other events be known to the people in this area. And this group has not been honored publicly, and so this museum is very proud to be the one that has brought these people out for you to be able to meet them. And I think they deserve a very warm applause.
Yeah, you the traffic out there. See, this street never used to go through till a year ago. Then they put it through over here to Ivanrest. And then they had to put the light up because there's so much traffic here and the mall up there.
These cars go by me. Sometimes you get chrome bumpers and stuff. All right, yeah, rolling.
Okay.
Want to ID first?
Yep, my name is Frank Boring with the Michigan Military Museum. Bob, if we could start out, could you tell what is your name and where were you born?
Oh, I'm Bob Hartman. I was born in Chicago, Illinois.
And what you... Okay. And could you tell us what your early schooling was like?
Well, I went to school in Muskegon through the kindergarten and stuff like that, but in Hall School here in Grand Rapids, and I wound up at South High School where I graduated in '37.
How did you first hear about the Guards?
My brother talked me into it. He was in the Guards, and he said it's a good way to make $1 or $2 a night. So, and things were tough back there, and so I'd been in the CCC camp for 6 months, and so later on, in '38, I joined the Guards with him.
What's the CCC camp?
Civilian Conservation Corps.
For those of us that don't know what that is, what is that?
Well, it's a group. They take you up in the forest up here, and you plant trees. That was our main objective, planting trees. And we got $30 a month for going to camp, and they sent 25 at home to our parents. So we lived on $5 a month, and we enjoyed it.
So what was the appeal of the National Guard?
Just being there with all the guys and talking, learning things. You start right from the beginning. You learn how to take a rifle apart and put it back together and drill and march in step and obey commands. One of the bad parts of it was that we used to wear the old wrap leggings in those days, and they were from World War I, and they were wide bandages that you wrapped around your legs and all the way up to the knee, and then you tied them and tucked them, and which is fine. But when you were in a parade and you were scared they were going to come unwrapped, and that was the worst part of it, when you're marching down Monroe Avenue and you're so afraid that that thing is going to come on loose, because they did if you didn't do it right.
About how old were you when you joined the Guards?
18.
Tell us a little bit more about your experience with the National Guards. Was this 7 days a week, or is it 4 days a week? All right.
1 weekend a month, but then we would take, other times they would call us up and we would report, and we would go on maneuvers right down to Holland, which is 30 miles away, or Muskegon, and we would interact with the troops from down there and be gone for the weekend. And we enjoyed it because that meant extra money for the days you were gone.
Was there a sense of danger going on in Europe and whatnot? Do you have any feeling of the war coming on?
Not that we really thought much about it. Being at that age, you didn't think much about it. And we didn't read the paper. We didn't get the coverage, you know, like they do now. We had radios, of course, but most people, you read the paper.
What was the training itself like? I mean, you mentioned the leggings of World War I. Was this more of a training for World War I type tactics?
Yes. Yes, they trained us to fight like they did in World War I, trench warfare. And that was the idea, that if we ever got into combat, we would fight the Germans or in Europe like they did in World War I.
Now, when did things change for you in terms of war is starting, and what was your reaction to that?
Well, when they started things in Germany, and they said we're going to go away, we had our choice. We could either go away, and they were going to draft everybody for a year. And they told us that you want to go right now and get your year in, you can go for a year and come back and evade the draft this way. So most of us just said, we'll go now. And in fact, I planned on getting married, so then I said to my wife-to-be, well, I'll go and put my year in now, and then after I come back, we can get married. And she said, okay, so I went away for the year, we thought. It was 5 years later we came back.
Let me ask you about at this point, were you formed into companies yet?
Yes. We were all in companies.
Could you tell, before you were talking about the individual companies and where they came from? That was wonderful. I wonder if you could go.
Sure, in the 126, we had 3 battalions, and A, B, C, and D were the 1st battalion. E, F, G, H was 2nd battalion, and the milk battalion was MLK and MILK. And the A company was from Coldwater, B company was from Adrian, C company from Kalamazoo, D company from Holland, E company was Big Rapids, G company was Muskegon, F company was Grand Haven, H company was Ionia, then M, I, L, and K were from Grand Rapids, plus service company, and the band and the medics were all from Grand Rapids.
Now, what company were you with?
I was with service company to start with.
And what was the service company?
Well, they had the trucks, most of the trucks, and they moved troops around, and they also furnished all the clothing. They were like a small quartermaster outfit only in the regiment. And we supplied the ammunition and the food and clothing and everything else that was needed.
Now, what did you do specifically?
I drove truck part of the time, and part of the time I was supply sergeant.
So you already achieved the rank of sergeant by this time?
Oh, yes. When I got married, I was a sergeant. A year later, I was made sergeant.
Well, this may sound like a stupid question, but what were your duties as a sergeant?
Well, at that time, I just handled the supply tent. And that was just mainly clothing and ammunition and rifles. We took care of all the rifles and all the armament. The armament we had in supply company was rifles. The other companies had machine guns and mortars, but we didn't have any. And we had sidearms. A lot of us had sidearms.
Now, try and give us an idea of what the daily life was like at this particular time. Got up in the morning, you went to breakfast. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, that was, if you were in a line company, you got up in the morning, you stood in line for breakfast, and depending on how long, you might be in line from anywhere from 10 minutes to 45 minutes, depending on the amount of time it took you. And then after breakfast, you got in line, you marched out in the field, and you went through a lot of training. And it was basically just run, fire, and fall down, and like they did in World War I.
Now, give us an idea of what the food was like at this particular place.
In Louisiana?
Yeah.
Oh, the food was pretty good, except it depended on your cooks. The meat that they served was and it depended on what. And we had men that went to baker school, could bake bread and pastries and cake and donuts, and if you had good bakers and good cooks, you got good food. And ours would vary depending on the mess sergeant and the cooks. And we would go from poor to good, but most of the time it was fairly good. Not very many complaints.
Was there any kind of schooling going on besides the training and was there any kind of training about where you were going? Or
No. Never a word was said except for the training. And we went on maneuvers, and that lasted, a month or two. And we ranged all around Texas, Louisiana, and as far over as Alabama and back, and it was just truck movements, and you had the Red Army and the Blue Army fighting each other. And out of this came a lot of officers that went to Europe, like Patton was in the maneuvers, Bradley was in the maneuvers, Eisenhower was part of the maneuvers, and I can't think of all of them, but they were all, it helped these officers. Plus we had a lot of officers from World War I. And we had, like our company commander at that time was Captain Henry D. McNaughton, who was the principal at Ottawa High School here. Our chaplain happened to be Reverend Dorr, who was the principal at South High School when I went there. So, I mean, and we had Colonel Howe, who was a teacher over at Union High School. And we had a lot of other men that were involved in the city of Grand Rapids that went with the Guards.
Just so people have a better understanding of the guys that you were with, were some of these people you knew, or at least you knew their families?
No, I didn't know anybody, any families. I had a friend, I met his family, but I knew his family, and I met Clayton. His name was Clayton Van Amberg. When he was drafted, our first draftees came in April, and we were there in October, and our first bunch of draftees happened to come from Grand Rapids area. And so we were lucky there because a lot of the guys met their friends, and then I was told that Clayton was going to be in the draft, and so I went over and saw him, and then I got him transferred to my company. And so we became buddies.
Now, when did things change for you then in terms of the training and all that? Now you got the word that you're going to go to war.
Right. Well, that was December 7th, really, of Pearl Harbor Day. And Clayton and I were up in Jackson, Mississippi. We had got, they used to come by and give us free tickets to go different places. And so we got some tickets to go up to, and a friend of mine who had another friend had a car, so three of us went up to Jackson, Mississippi, which was 100 miles away. And we saw Jackson, or the Old Miss play, and football, and then we came out and we found out that they had bombed Pearl Harbor, and for everybody to get back to camp as soon as they could.
What was your reaction?
Well, same as everybody else. Oh, we're in for it now. So we headed back to camp, and they just scattered us around. Like a lot of the troops were guarding various bridges and water supplies and things like that, and we stayed there for a few months, and then they shipped us up to Camp Fort Devonshire, Massachusetts.
Now, what happened? What happened there in Fort Devon, Massachusetts?
Well, we were there for about a month, and then they turned around and put us all on a plane, or a train rather, and sent us back to Frisco. And this was a fiasco because we landed in Frisco, and they had no place to bunk us. So they had the Cow Palace, which is a arena where they have rodeos. And it's all dirt floor and the seats all around, and it's all cement. And they said, you're going to stay here for a while. So the troops that were lucky got set down on the floor. Some were out in the aisles around there, where the refreshment stands used to be. And our company was told we're taking the seats. And they gave us folding cots, and they said, spread them across these seats. Now, if you've ever been in a place where you've sat down in these folding seats and tried to put an army cot across there, it's just impossible. So we tried it, just ridiculous, because the handles stick up. There was no place for the legs. So we wound up sitting up in the seats for about 10 days that we were there.
Give us an idea of the number of people that were at this Cow Palace.
Probably 5,000.
Okay.
That was our regimental strength, roughly.
So this is a lot of people
Right.
in a cow palace, basically.
Right. Well, some of them were in the dog track, which was next door. They only housed probably about 300-400 people. I don't know what the dog track was, or just a building where they raced dogs, I guess.
Well, what was the scuttlebutt going around during this time? I mean, you're anticipating getting into war, but what were you guys talking about?
Not much that we could talk about. We were just waiting our time and wondering where we were going to go. We knew we weren't going over to England like they planned, and we had no idea. We'd never heard of Australia, and much less New Guinea. And so then they took us over to Angel Island, which is a embarkation point, and then we were loaded on the lure line there.
So what were you told before you got on the lure line? I mean, did you know where you were going?
No, we had no idea. They told us part of the time over there, and I think it was quite a ways out before we ever found out we were going to Australia.
All right, so let's talk about getting on the lure line. Describe what the lure line was.
Well, the lure line was a luxury liner like they have today, only it was not as high class. The cabins were small, and they had 2 bunks in them, and they had a small bathroom and a sink, and that was about it. And I was lucky. My company, we were put up in the ballroom, and they were making the ballroom into a first aid room to bring back wounded. So they had double bunks, which were nice hospital-type bunks, only they were stacked too high. We had the huge windows that you could look out during the day, and the floor was magnificent. It was the dance floor that we were sitting on, and it was nice during the day, but at night they had the windows all painted, and you had to pull it up. You couldn't see anything out. The only thing is that most of us were seasick. That I got on board, and by the time we had gone under the Golden Gate, I was seasick. And I was seasick almost all the trip over. And the only thing I could keep down was bread and coffee. And they steamed their food in this place, and just the smell of steamed food made me sick. But I wasn't alone, and my CO, Al Miedendorf, said, it's just in your mind. You guys are just think you're seasick. But 2 days later, he was leaning over the rail like the rest of us. So we had no problem there.
I was understanding that a buddy of yours decided that he thought he had a cure for this called lemon drops.
Oh, yes. So Ed Zudzik thought lemon drops. And the purser, I think, was making money off of selling lemon drops because they were making a good deal. They'd sell you a jar of lemon drops for $1.50. And I got down 4 or 5 of them, and I just got sick of lemon drops. And and I'm heaving up lemon drops instead of everything else. But Ed Zudzik swore by him, so they helped him, so there must be something in the lemon drops. But they had no Dramamine. They had no Dramamine in those days. In fact, we had very little supplies like they have now. So we were not too lucky there.
Now, when you cross the the equator, and you have not crossed it before, there's a ceremony that it goes on, an infamous ceremony. Why don't you tell us about the King Neptune ceremony?
Well, they shave your head, and I'm trying to think, you're a pollywog until you get your head shaved and all this, and then you became a, what is it? I forget the term now, but it was quite a ceremony. They have one of the sailors dresses up like Father Neptune, and he has a spear and a thing, and they go around, they drag people out of the crowd, and they shave their heads, and I didn't get my head shaved then, but I liked it so well that I had my head shaved, and I've kept it shaved ever since.
So the trip over is quite difficult because of the seasickness and all. Where did you land when you finally...
We landed in Adelaide, and it took us 31 or 32 days for this trip, because we had to detour way out around, and I don't know how, but we detoured way out around, come in to Adelaide, which is the other end of Australia, because the Battle of the Coral Sea was going on with the Navy. And thank God we had our Navy out there to stop them, because we'd have probably been torpedoed. And then you zigzag every day, and they had two or three ships carrying troops. The 126 was on one troop ship, I know, and the 127 was on another, and the 128 was on another one. So there were three ships all from the Matson line carrying troops. And later on they took these same ships, I guess, and practically dismantled them and put on these standby things where you slept 5, 6 deep, one on top of the other. But we were lucky there, coming back, because troops slept like that. But I came back in a hospital ship.
We'll get into that later. When you arrived in Australia, did you have any interaction with the Australians?
Well, not too much. We landed, we were dressed up with our full wool uniforms. We had these old army coats that hung down to your ankles. We had army wools on. We had winter underwear even that they had issued us in Massachusetts, because we planned on going over to England. And it was going to be cold over there, and we got to Adelaide, and it was like 85 or 90 degrees in Adelaide, because you're close to the equator. But it took us a few days before we could get the regular type of uniforms. But we liked the Aussies. The Aussies were real good fighters, and they were good friends to us.
Now, is this the group that came from Tobruk?
Yeah, they called them the Rats of Tobruk. They fought in Africa, and for a couple of years they'd been fighting the Germans, and they stopped Rommel. And they were practically wiped out, and they came back to Australia, and they reorganized, and then they were sent up to New Guinea, and they were up to New Guinea ahead of us. We were not the first troops in New Guinea. The Aussies were there, and they went over the Owen Stanleys ahead of us. And they also helped, we used them as guides over the Owen.
Now, did you go through any kind of training or maneuvers at this time?
Not very much. We trained a little bit, not too much, because I don't think they knew what to train for. They had no idea. They'd go out in the morning, but the training was minimal.
Well, I think the interesting point here is that the actual training you've had was World War I style trench warfare, and here you are about to embark into the jungles.
Right. And then when we moved from Adelaide, we went by train up to Brisbane, which is the other side of New Guinea, or Australia. And they had one of the trouble areas that they have different gauges of trains. And so you have to unload everything. You go so far, they have 5 states in Australia, and you go to one state and then you have to unload, and because the tracks were a different gauge. And they would take everything off and go around and walk around, carry it, and put it down another train, go so far. We had 3 stops like that to get to Brisbane. Now I understand it's all one gauge. But they had the same problem here back in the 1800s.
So in Brisbane then, I have a note here about the uniforms and the camouflage. What kind of camouflage did you have, or what did you do?
Well, we had no camouflage. We were just old green fatigues. And they didn't want us wearing just khakis, of course. We wore our green fatigues. And somebody came up with a bright idea, and this came down from headquarters. They brought down some paint. And what kind of paint it was, I don't know, but they made us stand in line with our fatigues on, and they took brushes and they dipped them into the red, and they'd splash some here and they'd splash it around, green, blue, yellow. This was supposed to make us camouflage. The only thing is that if you get paint on your cloth, it just stiffens. And then later on, when you sweat, the paint goes through and winds up on your skin and itches and it drives you crazy. So there was 1 or 2 companies that did that, and my company was one of the ones that had to go through this painting thing. And we finally dumped all these old things and went back to wearing our old green fatigues in the jungle.
So you're now in Australia. You still don't know really where you're going.
No.
When was the turning point? When did you start to get into battle?
Well, when they took us up to Port Moresby. And we landed at Port Moresby, which was just a couple of shacks. And one of them was a hotel, and the other had a bar. The hotel had a bar, and the other was a small grocery store. There's, I think, three buildings there. Now they've got motels and 10 stories high and everything else.
Well, let's get an idea of the numbers here. This is still the entire regiment is arriving here? At 5,000 plus?
Yes, it's the entire division. The 127 and the 128 came up behind us. We were the spearhead of the spearhead. They picked the 32nd. See, there was 3 outfits that were picked to go: 37th, the 41st, and the 37th. Three divisions, and they made the 32nd the spearhead of the 3. And then they came along and said, well, we'll pick the 126 to be the spearhead of the division. And then they came along and they said, we'll pick 2nd Battalion to be the spearhead of the battalion. And then they came along and they said, we'll pick E Company to be the spearhead of the battalion, and wound up like that. So we were the spearhead of the spearhead of the spearhead.
Now, we had talked before about your being a sergeant and involved with trucks and all. What was your rank at this point, and what were your responsibilities?
Platoon sergeant, which was a staff sergeant in those days, and then they elevated it to tech sergeant. Staff sergeant had 1 stripe underneath, and platoon sergeant had 2.
So you have a lieutenant above you.
Yes, well,
a captain above that.
Half time.
But let's get back to you then. What were your specific responsibilities?
Make sure my platoon did everything right, and I looked after them like you would anybody that you're in charge of. And you're in command of the platoon, and the lieutenant gives you the orders, and I had buck sergeants underneath me, and they each had a squad, and I had 4 squads. When we were full strength, we wound up with my platoon at one time was a total of 20 men, and 3 of them were sergeants, so 20 men. You know, my buddy that was killed was a sergeant at that time, and he was a squad leader. But we had no squads really. We were just fighting men.
Well, we'll get to that as well. I'm trying to get an understanding of what the actual structure was before you actually went into battle. So you arrived at this small little area, as you say it, with a building and a couple of shacks and all that.
Right.
But I'm just trying to get a vision in my own mind of 5,000 plus men arriving at this? I mean, how did you actually get to the beach?
That was the beach.
Right, but how did you actually get there?
Oh, E Company flew. They were the first company to ever fly into combat. And of any company during World War II, they never heard of it. But they needed somebody there in a hurry, so they flew us up to Port Moresby, and from then we moved over to, we called it Kalamazoo because we couldn't pronounce the name. That was our base camp going over the Owen Stanleys, was Kalamazoo. And at that time, the tune that was popular was Kalamazoo. I've got a gal in Kalamazoo. And so that's where they picked it. And another reason they picked it was, see, we picked all code names for passwords with the letter L in them, because the Japanese could not pronounce L's. So I don't think it did us any good, but we used the word Roosevelt more than we did any other word for a password.
Now that you've arrived, this whole group of people on this beach,
right.
Where did you go?
We were at the 5 Mile Strip. It was there was an airport there that the Aussies had, and of course then the Americans took it over. It was called the 5 Mile Strip. And then from there, we based down at the end of it, and then we started walking over the Owen Stanley Mountain.
So you're literally getting off an airplane,
yeah,
and starting a march.
Yep, that's about it.
So tell us about the walk of the Owen Stanley.
Well, it was a nightmare. It's like climbing up a steep mountain with just a trail that was probably made by the natives for years, over the thousands of years that the natives were there. And they had one place there where Kalamazoo, they had a mission there, small mission, and a couple of Aussie missionaries, and they started us out, but we had native guides and a couple of Aussies leading us. But you clawed your way up this thing, and you would slide. It was the old thing, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. And it took us 30-some days to travel this distance.
Let's give an idea of people who have never been there. First of all, when you started the trip, was it in the morning, the afternoon, the night? When did you actually start?
About noon is when we first started going, because we landed there and we started right away.
What was the weather like?
Well, when we first started, it wasn't too bad. It was rainy because we were on that side of the cliff, but the higher up you got, the more it rained all the time. You couldn't even light a fire to warm your food. You ate it cold. And we ran out of food, and they used to drop sea rations. They'd throw them out of the sides of the planes, but they would crash and break. So then they tried parachutes, and we lost a colonel who was on the plane like that because the parachute got wrapped around the tail fin. So then they came and they asked for anybody know how to pack a parachute. And it turned out that we had, in our company, we had a fellow named Doc Slaughter. And his father and him used to have the balloon ascensions out to Reed's Lake here in the summer when I was a kid. And Doc was probably in his 30s at this time, but he knew how to, and his dad used to take this balloon, and hot air balloons, they'd go up, and then his dad would parachute out into the water or on the land. And so Doc was promoted to sergeant, and all he did the rest of the time was pack parachutes for the Air Corps. And they dropped him out of the parachutes, which is a lot better.
What was the terrain like?
Oh, jungle type all the way up and down. Just muddy. You grabbed a hold of a tree and pulled yourself up and just kept on going. You slung your rifle across your back and you kept your cartridge belt, but you threw away everything that you didn't need.
Well, let's get into that. You're fully packed when you actually got off the airplane.
Yes.
Give us an idea of what started to happen as you're moving through the jungle with this full pack.
First thing to go was our gas mask, because we figured they were useless. And then the next thing to go was your blankets, and we had what we called a shelter half. And maybe some of the guys held on to it. I threw mine away because I was wet all day long, and you couldn't sleep hardly at night anyway. So we threw away our shelter halves, we threw away our tent stakes, we threw away everything but our ammunition and our rifles. And even threw away, they used to give us big machetes, and those were cumbersome. So I threw mine away, and I kept my bayonet, and I sharpened that in case I wanted to cut my way through and cut something. I could use my bayonet, and that's all I used my bayonet for. I don't think I ever put it on my rifle like they were taught back in the States, and put it on your rifle and charge forward with the bayonet. And we used to go through bayonet drills, stabbing things, and that we didn't use them for that.
We're still looking at thousands of men going through this.
Right.
Try to give us an idea of could you see the people around you?
See the guys ahead of you and behind you. That's about it. That's about all. And it wasn't 1,000, there was just one battalion. The rest of them flew up. When we got over there, we took the airstrip, the old airstrip that they'd had over there, and fixed it so that they could land planes on it. And then they started flying in the rest of the outfits.
So, were there any casualties or skirmishes or anything as you were?
No. And the only bad part was that, and I was lucky, I didn't get, some of the guys got malaria, and they just suffered along with the rest of us going over. But there was no way to evacuate them. There was no way to evacuate anybody. If anybody had broke a leg, I don't know what they'd have done. But as far as I know, nobody was. We had a lot of small injuries where the guys had fallen and hurt themselves. But as far as, and it was climbing up was the worst. And once you got on the other side, you kind of slid down on your rump.
So what happened after you got to the bottom?
Well, then we got, some of the companies got into combat, but the Aussies had kind of cleared out most of it. But then a couple of days later, we were taken over to the Bloody Triangle, and there was a pillbox there, and we were supposed to take this pillbox.
Well, before we get into that, back up just a little bit. You said some of the companies got into battle. Did you actually hear the sounds of battle?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. We weren't that far apart. We couldn't see each other, but you could hear gunfire all the time, practically.
So this may sound like a stupid question, but what was your, I mean, and I realize this is many, many years ago, but do you remember the first time you heard gunshots or any of the sounds of battle, knowing you're about to literally get into battle?
Yeah, probably about that time. That's when your stomach starts to knot up. And if anybody thinks they weren't scared, they're crazy. We were all scared, but the way I looked at it, I was scared just as well as anybody else. And most of us were, but most of us, we hid it. We acted like, well, you know, what the heck, this is nothing, you know, and we had to, especially being in a position of a platoon sergeant, I had to let my men know that I was their leader, and I wasn't scared. And if they only knew how scared I was, we'd have all ran, you know. But you just hide it, and you act like this was everyday thing, you know, and you cuss, and things go on as normal.
So as you're approaching the battle, the thing that I really think it's important for people to realize is that this is dense jungle.
Oh, you can't see 20, 30 feet ahead of you. There's times when you could see, there would be patches of kunai grass or that, where you could see across them, but you never knew what was on the other side of that. See, that was what we found at the triangle. That there was a kunai patch there, and right in front of it, the other end of it, was this pillbox, and we're trying to take it.
Well, let's for people who don't know, what's kunai grass?
It's a grass that grows anywhere from 2 foot to 12 foot high. It's sharp as a razor, And if you don't watch yourself, you can cut yourself and it will bleed. I mean, it can make you bleed. And sometimes if you went through there fast, you come out of there with cuts all over your hands and face. And they always show, most of the time they show pictures of these men in the jungle without, bare to the waist, and it's just the opposite. We covered ourselves up for this simple reason, that we kept the bugs and everything off us, and it was warmer even with a wet thing on than it was with nothing. But we go through this kunai grass, we would have scars all over our body from it.
So you're now approaching this pillbox. Now, you were told to take the pillbox, or you just come upon it?
Oh, I was told to take it. The sergeant pillbox out there, go get it. So I went out there with my men, and I'm leading them, and I come across, they pointed in a general direction, and I come across a path that was cut. It was cut like way down low. And I said, why am I going through this tall grass? Now I can see where I'm going. So I start crawling down this path that had been cut, like it mowed. And all of a sudden it dawned on me that this is not a path. This is a pre-cut path. That it's a term I'm trying to think of, fire lane. And at the other end of it is a machine gun trained on me. And this thought hit me, I just instinctively dived for the other side. And as I did, they cut loose with their machine gun, and I got hit in the arm. But they clipped my bandolier, knocked that off, and luckily I had my rifle like that, and they hit the stock of the rifle. That might have been dangerous. But I got to the other side, and I knew I was hit, and I'm laying on my arm. And all I could think of, how bad am I hit? I knew I was hit. And it turned out it was just a minor flesh wound. I've still got it right there. But it's scary. And you lay there, you're scared to look. So then finally I lay there, and I hollered at my men, don't come out here, don't come out here, for Christ's sake, don't come out here. So then I waited there a while, and finally I just made a mad dash across. I got across before they could fire again. So then we went up through the tall grass, but it got so bad we had to pull back. We lost a couple men there.
From the machine gun fire?
Yeah, from the machine gun. So we pulled back then.
What happens to the guys that get shot in a situation like that?
We dragged them back, and then the burial unit took over.
Now, this group that you were leading were approximately how many men?
Started out with about 30.
I mean, at the pillbox, there was 30, okay, 30 guys. All right.
Yeah, I had no lieutenant at that time either.
Why not?
Well, they put him somewhere else. They were so short on officers. The officers, when we first got up there, the officers used to wear their badges, their insignia, and second lieutenants and their bars and the captains and all that. And finally, everybody smartened up. Even nobody, and they took these off and dressed like the regular men, because the Japanese were told to pick off the officers first. And that's what we tried to do. We tried to get their officers first. Because when we got their officers, they were disorganized. They didn't realize that in the American Army, you might get an officer, but you got men qualified because we could think for ourselves. And the Japanese were not allowed to think for themselves. I think that made a big difference. Plus, our firepower was greater than theirs. We only had the M1 rifle, which fired 8 rounds at a time, or one shot at a time. And they had, well, we trained with the old .3, where you pulled the bolt back and slammed it in, then fired again, then pulled the bolt back, and which was a fine rifle for target practice, but it's no good in combat because it's too slow. So just before we got to Australia, they issued us the M1s, which were, one clip held 8 shots, and You could pull off 8 shots without doing anything, and then the clip would fly out. You throw another one in, and you were all set. And the M1 never jammed either. That was a good one. Ed Zudzig, my friend, carried a Tommy gun, and we wouldn't carry one because they jammed. And Ed said that one time his jammed when he needed it bad, because they were the old Tommy guns that the G-men used to carry, that type of thing. That's what we had. And they weren't too good for jungle warfare.
We're talking not just hours, we're talking days
Right.
that this is going on.
Oh, 3 months.
Right, but give us an idea of, it wasn't constant battle every single moment. There were moments you could sit down to eat. What were you eating?
Well, sea rations, which were just beans, 1 can of beans, 1 can of hash, 1 can of stew, and another small can that held 3 or 4 little hardtack cookies, plus a little can of instant coffee. And it wasn't as good as the instant coffee today, but it was then pieces of sugar and a couple of pieces of candy. But we've got to the point where we're living on 1 can of sea ration a day, which is like 4 ounces. But we couldn't carry more. We didn't want to carry more. When you dived, we were out on patrol or something, or going along, and all of a sudden they cut loose, you want to hit the ground. You don't want anything between you and the ground. And in fact, there was times when you didn't even want to carry a pack of cigarettes there because it kept you away from the ground. I mean, that might sound silly, but not when you got bullets flying at you.
So there were several skirmishes throughout this period of time.
Oh, yes. We were combat all the time. We could go back maybe a day, and one guy would go back, and just another thing we did, I did it a couple times myself, we'd pick one guy and take his helmet. We'd go back and we'd get some canned heat, which was hard to get. Otherwise, if we could build a fire with something, we would. And we'd use this helmet for a cooking pot. And first thing you had to do was cook all the paint off the inside of the helmet, because you want to eat that. And then we would throw in a handful of rice and a can of beans and mix them up, and 4 or 5 guys would share it. And one time I went back, and I was going to really do something good. I took a can of beans, I got from one guy, and a can of stew from the other, and a can of hash from the other, and I threw in 2 handfuls of rice, and it's all over the place, but it was a mixture of all these things with the rice, and we ate it. And anybody ever told me the day I'd eat that, I'd tell them they were crazy. But when you're hungry, you eat what you get.
Where do you get water?
Oh, out of the streams, out of the rivers, out of anything. And we had canteens, of course, that we carried our canteen. We had chlorine tablets that we put in there. And then about when you got a chance, if you ever got any time off, you'd knock the mud out of the bottom of your canteen, because you'd probably get a ½ inch of mud on the bottom of your canteen. And at one time, and this wasn't the only time, we were drinking this water. Come to find out, there was some dead Japs in the stream up ahead of us. But this wasn't isolated. This was common. But we drank any water we could. We had no water was carried in. You drank the water that was there, and most of the time it was pretty good. You know, but you got to hate the taste of the chlorine in it, but you weren't going to take any chances to not.
Now, what about change of clothes, socks, boots? You took it down to the local laundromat? And
We stayed with the same clothes all the time. And we didn't bathe, we didn't shave. I didn't shave for over almost 3 months. Everybody grew a beard because the beard kept the mosquitoes net off your face. And that tried to help with malaria. Because I didn't get malaria till almost towards the end of the campaign.
Let's go into that. In addition to the danger of fighting the Japanese and the danger of just getting through the jungle and all the infections and diseases and all that, tell us about the effect of malaria and dysentery on your group.
Well, dysentery you just put up with, but malaria, at first they were sending them home with 98 or 99 or 100 fever, and then it got up to 102, and they were sending them back to Australia. And some of the guys, that's where we got our worst casualties from, was from malaria. And I got up to 103, and by that time they just took me back to the first aid tent, or it's a canopy, and lay me down and gave me 25 grams of quinine. And I took that, and I was practically delirious because of the quinine and the fever, and I lay there for 24 hours, and the fever broke, and I went back to the line. But we all did this that were left, because they couldn't afford to send us back. If they'd have sent everybody back, we'd have been overrun and been annihilated. Like we were told, in fact, General Harding, who was our first general, wanted to pull the 32nd Division out, and he told MacArthur, these men have gone through too much to stay here. MacArthur pulled Harding back off the line, and he sent up Robert L. Eichelberger, who was a 3-star general, and told Eichelberger, and I found this out later because I was at the hearing, Eichelberger was told either keep going or don't come back. And Eichelberger had no choice, but we realized it later, anybody that had any sense realized it later, that if we'd have stopped fighting and waited for reinforcements, that the Japs would have overcome us. But we just kept pushing, and that's the only thing that saved us, because we were outnumbered about 7-1. But like I say, our firepower was better than theirs.
Now, you didn't know you were outpowered 7-1.
We knew we were outpowered. We didn't know what the number was. We just knew that there was more Japs there than there was of us.
What is it like to have malaria in battle?
Oh, your ears ring and your eyes water, and you just keep going. It's like having a flu or something, and you just keep going, but just worse than a flu. I had recurrent malaria after the war, and for every 30 days I would come down with malaria, and I had that for about 5 years, and it decreased every year until finally it went away.
Now, I've talked to some of your fellow Red Arrows who talked about the heaviness of the rifle. When you're sick like that, the rifle is so heavy.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. But it only weighed, what, 7 or 6 pounds, something like that. I forget what it was now. But it seemed a lot heavier. But still, you hung on to it. That was your bread and butter. You didn't get rid of your rifle. And that's one thing we liked about the M1. You didn't have to clean them very often. You could drop them in the mud, pick them up, and wipe them off, and they'd still keep on firing. I never heard of a one that didn't stop. And even some of the Marines that used the M1, and they swore by it too.
In your opinion, how did you adapt to jungle fighting when your entire training has been trench World War I type warfare?
It's either adapt or die. That's what, it was that simple. And you just make up your mind you're going to do it, so you do it.
Did you see a lot of men around you getting killed?
Not too many, because you're in your own little battle, and it's that way. And through Vietnam and all these other wars, there might be a huge, like for instance, the Normandy. These men don't see all these men down the beaches dying. They see just this group that's 10 feet on either side. You lose your peripheral vision. You just focus on going ahead and doing what you please. You watch the guys on this side, watch the guys on that side. You don't have time to look around and see what the other guys are doing. And that's the way it was, but I saw a few men die, too many.
In terms of this jungle warfare, and you've got the guy on the right, the guy on the left. You can hardly see anything in front of you. What was the sounds like? I mean, I'm picturing like bullets whizzing through the leaves, and I mean, what was the sound of the battle like?
Well, there's a lot of noise, and the Japanese rifle, they shot a .25 caliber, and it was faster than ours. It moved faster, which didn't make any difference, and but it cracked. It made a cracking sound. You could hear it hit. It's like, almost like a firecracker. And it wasn't a loud sound, but we could tell it. We could tell when the machine guns were firing. We could just from hear them, which machine gun was the Japanese, which was our 50 caliber, which was our 30 caliber, and they had a little thing there they called the knee mortar, N-E-I was printed on this thing, and it was a little mortar about 18 inches high with a little tube like that. And we overtook some Japanese that had these mortars, and they had the shells in there, and somebody was looking at this, and they said it's a knee mortar. Well, on the base, it's oval-shaped, base like that, and somebody thought the knee mortar you could put on your knee and fire. Well, I think somebody did try to fire it like that, and it broke their leg. But it was just, manufacturer's name was knee, N-E-I, and you could put them against a tree was what it was. They put them against a tree and throw and fire their mortar shells. And they used their hand grenades were not as good as ours. They were just as dangerous, but they had a wooden plug in their hand grenade, and they had a pin through it, and with a string around it, and they unwind the string and pull the pin out, and then they had to turn the hand grenade over and hit it onto something hard, and drive the pin on the end of that wooden plug into the explosive to set it off, and then they had about 3 seconds to get rid of it. Where ours, we just pulled the pin and let the handle fly in through it. But we liked the Aussies better than ours, because the Aussies, our hand grenades were 5-second grenades. And if you pulled the pin and threw it, sometimes the Japanese would pick it up and throw it back. So we used the Aussies, which was another 3-second grenade, and you pulled the pin on theirs and threw it, and it went off when it hit. And so it was either that or learn to count. And most of the time, when you pull that pin, you don't want to count. You don't want to take time to say 1,001, 1,002. You're afraid it might go off in your hand, because some of them were premature. Same way with our mortar shells. Our mortar shells had little packets that you drop down in there, and they ignited and shot the mortar fires up. But those things got damp in the jungle, and half the time they'd only go half as far as they were supposed to, which was the only heavy weapon we had in the jungle, was a mortar. We had machine guns and 30 caliber and 50 caliber, but no cannon, nothing else like that. Mostly just rifle. And one time up there, I went there at the time, we got a shipment in where it came from. I think it was supposed to be for the MPs. They got in some crates of rifles we thought were rifles. They were shotguns. And we thought, this is the best weapon they've ever come out of. The minute they found out that, they took them right away and took them back, because it was against the Geneva Conference. But can you imagine what a shotgun would have done in the jungle would have been 10 times better than a rifle.
You were injured the first time with superficial wounds, which I assume they just kind of patched you up and you just had to heal by yourself.
No.
What was the next incident?
Well, that was when we made a beach landing at Atapi. First we landed at Sador, and our beach landings were nothing like Normandy. The Navy came in and shelled the beaches, and the planes came in and dropped bombs on the beaches and that. And it was at points where the Japs had congregated. What the Japs, and they didn't know any more than we did, they were waiting to be picked up by the Japanese Navy. And the Japanese Navy was not around to pick them up, and they weren't going to. As far as Japanese concerned, these were all dead men. But these guys, the Japanese, didn't know they were dead till they were left there. They finally surrendered. But so there wasn't too many of them at Sador. So we landed. There was some skirmishing and some fighting, and a few guys got killed, but mostly Japanese. And we just pushed them right back. And then a month or two later, we landed at Atapi. And I was behind the lines then. I was walking up. And all of a sudden I got hit, and I think it was a sniper, and I'm not sure whether it was a ricochet or what, but it went through my cartridge belt, and it's lucky it didn't set off any of the ammunition in there. Went through my web belt, the cartridge belt, my regular belt, and my clothing, and lodged in my stomach, right in here. And they took me out on a stretcher and took me to the hospital, base hospital there, and they operated on me. They took the bullet out, and apparently it hadn't gone in too far or something. And then they took me back to Australia, and then from there I went back to the United States, and I was in the hospital for various times, various camps. I started at Brooks General in San Antone. I was in a hospital up in Illinois, and I wound up spending about 6 months down here in Percy Jones, which is here in Battle Creek.
Now, when you returned back to the States, your family was informed that you were okay? I mean,
Yeah.
Okay, so there was no worry that you were dead or anything
No.
like that. When did you first see your family again?
When I got back, when they left me out of they let me go home, and I was able to go right back home. Now I had to report back to Brooks General.
Well, what was the reaction of your family when you came home?
Oh, I guess they were good to see me, but we had no brass bands or anything like they have now. The only one that met me at the depot was my mother and father, and my wife and her mother and father. And it was that way with all of us. But we didn't care. We were back. We didn't care. But this was 2.5 years later.
Yeah. I think there's a couple more questions I want to have of you. What is the distinction of the Red Arrow compared to any other battle unit? What is the one big distinction?
We put in more combat time than almost any other outfit ever in combat. And we went through some of the toughest of the fighting without any experience at all. We were green troops. And I heard a commentator say one time on the radio that, well, the troops are green going over there to Iraq. What they need is experienced troops. That's not true. I mean, you're going to fight if it's just to save your own life. You're going to learn, and you adapt. And Steve Janicki and I both agree with this, that you're not fighting for your country, you're fighting for yourself, really, what it comes down to. Because if somebody had come up to me halfway through Boona and said, hey, Bob, you can leave here now and go home, I'd have gone home. So would everybody else. But you stay because you have to stay. Nobody's going to sell you. Go home. And you adapt, I mean, and then we got some time off in Australia. We'd learned to make beach landings in Australia. And then we went back up. We landed at Milne Bay, and then we went over to Goodenough Island. And there was a little set to in Goodenough Island that I was in charge of. I knew the colonel and Colonel Schnipke, and we were there on Thanksgiving of '43. And we had just landed there, and it was a couple of days before Thanksgiving. So we went back to the quartermaster because we heard they were giving out turkeys. And the quartermaster said, no, you guys can't get turkeys because these are for the base people here. You guys are going to be leaving in a few days. So I went back and told the colonel, and he was furious. He went to General Harding, and General Harding blew his stack. I think it wasn't General Harding, it was General. And they went back down there, and we got the turkeys that were meant for the base people. And we had turkeys kazoo. We had cooked, everybody was cooking turkeys, and there was like a turkey for every 2 men. We got they gave us every turkey they had on hand. That was before we made our beach landing at Sador.
Right. Bob, to wrap up here, I just wanted to ask you a question. It's more of a personal question. What do you feel personally, what was the effect of your being in the Red Arrow, the battle experience you had, the experience you had in the military? How did that affect the rest of your life?
Oh, it hasn't really affected much, except I found a lot of buddies that we all have the same thing in common, and we have a kinship that nobody else can have, and that's why we're a dying outfit. You know, we don't want to bring in anybody else. They talk about bringing in our sons and that, and I have a son, but I'm not going to ask him to become a member of this, because we have something that even my son could not achieve, you know. I have a son-in-law that was in Vietnam. I lost a brother in Korea, and he was in the infantry, or he was in the infantry, he was in the combat engineers, and I lost him in Korea, and been tough on my mother.
Yeah. Well, I was very honored to meet all of you when we got together for the first time, and then was very pleased that the museum was able to put on that symposium, which all of you were at, and I was just very, very honored, sir, that we're here, and I'm hoping that your family and your future family are going to be able to have the same kind of joy of saying that I had a chance to know you.
Yeah.
All right, I
I
guess.
appreciate it.
Yeah, I think that should wrap it up right there.
Okay.
And hold on, because you're still hooked up there. If we could have one last shot of me and Bob together here.
Yeah, I don't have a still camera, but I
That's
can
all right.
get a still from there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fine to make still Bob.
All right,
We're
great.
good.
Who was a 3-star general, and told Eichelberger, and I found this out later because I was at the hearing, Eichelberger was told either keep going or don't come back. And Eichelberger had no choice, but we realized it later, anybody that had any sense realized it later, that if we'd have stopped fighting and waited for reinforcements, that the Japs would have overcome us. But we just kept pushing, and that's the only thing that saved us, because we were outnumbered about 7-1. But like I say, our firepower was better than theirs.
Now, you didn't know you were outpowered 7-1.
We knew we were outpowered. We didn't know what the number was. We just knew that there was more Japs there than there was of us.
What is it like to have malaria in battle?
Oh, your ears ring and your eyes water, and you just keep going. It's like having a flu or something. You just keep going, but just worse than a flu. I had recurrent malaria after the war, and for every 30 days, I would come down with malaria, and I had that for about 5 years, and it decreased every year until finally it went away.
Now, I've talked to some of your fellow Red Arrows who talked about the heaviness of the rifle. When you're sick like that, the rifle is so heavy.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. But it only weighed, what, 7 or 6 pounds, something like that. I forget what it was now. But it seemed a lot heavier. But still, you hung on to it. That was your bread and butter. You didn't get rid of your rifle. And that's one thing we liked about the M1. You didn't have to clean them very often. You could drop them in the mud, pick them up, and wipe them off, and they'd still keep on firing. I never heard of a one that didn't stop. And even some of the Marines that used the M1, and they swore by it too.
In your opinion, how did you adapt to jungle fighting when your entire training has been trench World War I type warfare.
It's either adapt or die. That's what, it was that simple. And you just make up your mind you're going to do it, so you do it.
Did you see a lot of men around you getting killed?
Not too many, because you're in your own little battle, and it's that way. And through Vietnam and all these other wars, there might be a huge, like for instance, the Normandy. These men don't see all these men down the beaches dying. They see just this group that's 10 feet on either side. You lose your peripheral vision. You just focus on going ahead and doing what you please. You watch the guys on this side, watch the guys on that side. You don't have time to look around and see what the other guys are doing. And that's the way it was, but I saw a few men die, too many.
In terms of this jungle warfare, and you've got the guy on the right, the guy on the left, you can hardly see anything in front of you. What was the sounds like? I mean, I'm picturing like bullets whizzing through the leaves, and I mean, what was the sound of the battle like?
Well, there's a lot of noise, and the Japanese rifle, they shot a .25 caliber, and it was faster than ours. It moved faster, which didn't make any difference, and but it cracked. It made a cracking sound. You could hear it hit. It's almost like a firecracker. And it wasn't a loud sound, but we could tell it. We could tell when the machine guns were firing. We could just from hear them, which machine gun was the Japanese, which was our 50 caliber, which was our 30 caliber, and they had a little thing there they called the knee mortar. N-E-I was printed on this thing, and it was a little mortar about 18 inches high with a little tube like that. And we overtook some Japanese that had these mortars, and they had the shells in there, and somebody was looking at this, and they said it's a knee mortar. Well, on the base, it's oval-shaped, base like that, and somebody thought the knee mortar you could put on your knee and fire. Well, I think somebody did try to fire it like that, and it broke their leg. But it was just, manufacturer's name was knee, N-E-I, and you could put them against a tree was what it was. They put them against a tree and throw and fire their mortar shells. And they used their hand grenades were not as good as ours. They were just as dangerous, but they had a wooden plug in their hand grenade, and they had a pin through it and with a string around it, and they unwind the string and pull the pin out, and then they had to turn the hand grenade over and hit it onto something hard and drive the pin on the end of that wooden plug into the explosive to set it off, and then they had about 3 seconds to get rid of it. Where ours, we just pulled the pin and let the handle fly in through it. But we liked the Aussies better than ours, because the Aussies, our hand grenades were 5-second grenades. And if you pulled the pin and threw it, sometimes the Japanese would pick it up and throw it back. So we used the Aussies, which was another 3-second grenade, and you pulled the pin on theirs and threw it, and it went off when it hit. And so it's either that or learn to count. And most of the time, when you pull that pin, you don't want to count. You don't want to take time to say 1,001, 1,002. You're afraid it might go off in your hand, because some of them were premature. Same way with our mortar shells. Our mortar shells had little packets that you dropped down in there, and they ignited and shot the mortar fires up. But those things got damp in the jungle, and half the time they'd only go half as far as they were supposed to, which was the only heavy weapon we had in the jungle, was a mortar. We had machine guns and 30 caliber and 50 caliber, but no cannon, nothing else like that. Mostly just rifle. And we one time up there, I went there at the time, we got a shipment in where it came from. I think it was just supposed to be for the MPs. They got in some crates of rifles we thought were rifles. They were shotguns. And we thought, this is the best weapon they've ever come out of. The minute they found out that, they took them right away and took them back, because it it was against the Geneva Conference. But can you imagine what a shotgun would have done in the jungle compared, would have been 10 times better than a rifle.
You were injured the first time with superficial wounds, which I
Yeah.
assume they just kind of patched you up
Right.
and you just had to heal by yourself.
No.
What was the next incident?
Well, that was when we made a beach landing at Atapi. First we landed at Sador, and our beach landings were nothing like Normandy. The Navy came in and shelled the beaches, and the planes came in and dropped bombs on the beaches and that. And it was at points where the Japs had congregated. What the Japs, and they didn't know any more than we did, they were waiting to be picked up by the Japanese Navy. And the Japanese Navy was not around to pick them up, and they weren't going to. As far as Japanese concerned, these were all dead men. But these guys, the Japanese didn't know they were dead till they were left there. They finally surrendered. But so there wasn't too many of them at Sador. So we landed. There was some skirmishing and some fighting, and a few guys got killed, but mostly Japanese. And we just pushed them right back. And then a month or two later, we landed at Atapi. And I was behind the lines then, and I was walking up, and all of a sudden I hit, and I think it was a sniper, and I'm not sure whether it was a ricochet or what, but it went through my cartridge belt, and it's lucky it didn't set off any of the ammunition in there. Went through my web belt, the cartridge belt, my regular belt, and my clothing, and lodged in my stomach, right in here. And they took me out on a stretcher and took me to the hospital, base hospital there, and they operated on me. They took the bullet out, and apparently it hadn't gone in too far or something. And then they took me back to Australia, and then from there I went back to the United States, and I was in the hospital for various times, various camps. I started at Brooks General in San Antone. I was in a hospital up in Illinois, and I wound up spending about 6 months down here in Percy Jones, which is here in Battle Creek.
Now, when you returned back to the States, your family was informed that you were okay? I mean,
Yeah.
Okay, so there was no worry that you were dead or anything
No.
like that. When did you first see your family again?
Well, when I got back, when they left me out of, they let me go home, and I was able to go right back home. Now I had to report back to Brooks General.
Well, what was the reaction of your family when you came home?
Oh, I guess it was good to see me, but we had no brass bands or anything like they have now. The only one that met me at the depot was my mother and father, and my wife and her mother and father. And it was that way with all of us. But we didn't care. We were back. We didn't care. But this was 2.5 years later.
Yeah, I think there's a couple more questions I want to have of you. What is the distinction of the Red Arrow compared to any other battle unit? What is the one big distinction?
We put in more combat time than almost any other outfit ever in combat. And we went through some of the toughest of the fighting without any experience at all. We were green troops. And I heard a commentator say one time on the radio, but well, the troops are green going over there to Iraq. What they need is experienced troops. That's not true. I mean, you're going to fight if it's just to save your own life. You're going to learn, and you adapt. And Steve Janicki and I both agree with this, that you're not fighting for your country, you're fighting for yourself, really, what it comes down to. Because if somebody had come up to me halfway through Boona and said, "Hey, Bob, you can leave here now and go home," I'd have gone home. So would everybody else. But you stay because you have to stay. Nobody's going to tell you. Go home. And you adapt. I mean, and then we got some time off in Australia. We'd learned to make beach landings in Australia. And then we went back up We landed at Milne Bay, and then we went over to Goodenough Island. And there was a little set to in Goodenough Island that I was in charge of. I knew the colonel and Colonel Schnipke, and we were there on Thanksgiving of '43. And we had just landed there, and it was a couple of days before Thanksgiving. So we went back to the quartermaster because we heard they were giving out turkeys. And the quartermaster said, "No, you guys can't get turkeys because these are for the base people here. You guys are going to be leaving in a few days." So I went back and told the colonel, and he was furious. He went to General Harding, and General Harding blew his stack. Or I think, no, it wasn't General Harding, it was General. And they went back down there, and we got the turkeys that were meant for the base people. And we had turkeys gazoo. We had cooked, everybody was cooking turkeys, and there was like a turkey for every 2 men. We got, they gave us every turkey they had on hand. That was before we made our beach landing at Sador.
Right. Bob, to wrap up here, I just wanted to ask you a question. It's more of a personal question. What do you feel personally, what was the effect of your being in the Red Arrow, the battle experience you had, the experience you had in the military? How did that affect the rest of your life?
Oh, it hasn't really affected much, except I found a lot of buddies that we all got the same thing in common, and we have a kinship that nobody else can have, and that's why we're a dying outfit. You know, we don't want to bring in anybody else. They talk about bringing in our sons and that, and I have a son, but I'm not going to ask him to become a member of this, because we have something that even my son could not achieve, you know. I have a son-in-law that was in Vietnam. I lost a brother in Korea, and he was in the infantry, or he wasn't in the infantry, he was in the combat engineers, and I lost him in Korea, and it's been tough on my mother.
Yeah. Well, I was very honored to meet all of you when we got together for the first time, and then was very pleased that the museum was able to put on that symposium, which all of you were at, and I was just very, very honored, sir, that we're here, and I'm hoping that your family and your future family are going to be able to have the same kind of joy of saying that I had a chance to know you.
Yeah.
All right, I
I
guess.
appreciate it.
Yeah, I think that should wrap it up right there.
Okay.
And hold on, because you're still hooked up there. If we could have one last shot of me and Bob together here.
Yeah, and I don't have the still camera, but I can
That's all right.
get a still from there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fine. I can make stills out of it. All right. That was with Bears fancy still. Plain old film camera. Good.
All right,
We're
great.
good.